Look at this place. It's incredible. The cars are untouched. We found it. This red one is perfect. I'm getting in. Careful, check for traps. There it is. The vault. Look at those cars. Incredible. And the treasure. This is it. We found it. Careful, let's check the car. The gold is real. Whoa, look at this place. I told you, the treasure is here. And the cars, this is insane. Careful, it's real gold. Unbelievable. Whoa, look at this place. Over here, you have to see this. A red sports car, incredible. And gold bars. This is it.
The heavy oak door slammed shut, leaving 19-year-old Wyatt and his younger sister shivering on the porch. Homeless, discarded by their family, with nothing but $5 and their dead grandfather's rusty pocket watch, they thought their lives were over. They did not know they were about to become millionaires. The rain lashed against the cracked windshield of Wyatt's rusted Ford Ranger, each drop sounding like a mocking drumbeat. Inside the cramped cab, the air was thick with the smell of damp wool and lingering disbelief. In the passenger seat, 17-year-old Sloane sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her tear-streaked face pressed against the cold glass. She was staring blankly at the sprawling wrought-iron gates of the estate they used to call home. Just hours earlier, the siblings had been sitting in the mahogany-paneled office of Gregory Finch, the family's estate lawyer. The occasion was the reading of their grandfather Harlan's will. Harlan Bennett had been a wealthy, eccentric man, a former structural engineer who had made a fortune in mid-century real estate before retreating to his sprawling acres on the forested outskirts of Blackwood Creek. He was the only real parent Wyatt and Sloane had ever known. Their actual father was a passive, distant figure who had completely surrendered his spine to his second wife, Vivian, a woman whose disdain for her stepchildren was matched only by her love for Harlan's bank accounts. When Harlan passed away suddenly from a stroke, Wyatt and Sloane assumed they would be taken care of. Harlan had promised them as much, but as Gregory Finch read the documents, the bottom fell out of their world. To my son, David, and his wife, Vivian, I leave the estate, the liquid assets and all properties above ground, Finch had recited, pushing his spectacles up his nose, refusing to meet Wyatt's eyes. And to my grandchildren, Wyatt and Sloane? David had asked, though Vivian's sharp, triumphant smile suggested she already knew the answer. Finch sighed, pulling the small velvet pouch from his desk. To Wyatt and Sloane, Harlan leaves this single item, accompanied by a note. Vivian had not even waited for the siblings to process the shock. The moment they returned to the estate, her true colours flared. With Harlan gone, there was no one to protect them. She gave them minutes to pack a single duffel bag each. David had stood silently by the staircase, staring at the floorboards as Vivian literally shoved Wyatt out the front door, tossing Sloane's backpack into the mud after them. "You are an adult now, Wyatt," Vivian had sneered from the porch. "Time to stop freeloading and take your sister with you. She is your problem now." Now sitting in the freezing truck, Wyatt unclenched his jaw and looked down at his lap. In his bruised hands rested the entirety of their inheritance, a tarnished, heavy brass pocket watch and a scrap of heavy parchment paper. "Wyatt?" Sloane's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with cold and fear. "Where are we going to sleep tonight? We do not have enough gas to make it to the city." "I do not know, Sloane," Wyatt admitted, the crushing weight of his failure pressing down on his chest. He was 19. He worked part-time at a local hardware store. He had no savings, no credit, and now no home. "We will figure it out. We always do." He flicked on the dim cab light and picked up the note Harlan had left. It was written in his grandfather's familiar, erratic scrawl. "Wyatt, Sloane, if you are reading this, David and the viper he married have likely taken everything. Let them have the house. The house is just wood and glass. I taught you both to look deeper. The time is ticking. Stop crying. Start winding. Find the weeping stone before the valley floods. Grandpa Harlan." Wyatt frowned. "Stop crying. Start winding." He picked up the heavy brass pocket watch. It was not a standard timepiece. The face was strange, devoid of standard numbers, marked instead with heavy hash marks and strange engraved symbols that looked almost like topographical lines. It had not ticked in years, The hands were frozen stubbornly at a certain hour. Wyatt ran his thumb over the winding crown at the top. He pulled it up, attempting to adjust the hands, but it was jammed tight. Frustrated, he pressed down hard on the crown. Click. The back casing of the watch sprang open. Sloane gasped, leaning over the center console. "What is that?" Wyatt angled the watch under the dim overhead light. The back compartment did not contain gears or springs. Instead, there was a miniaturized, meticulously engraved brass dial resting over a tiny compass. Folded neatly beneath the dial was a square of ultra-thin, translucent drafting paper. With trembling fingers, Wyatt unfolded the paper. It was a map, not of a city, but of the very woods they were parked outside of. The dense, untamed forestry that made up the northernmost acres of Harlan's property. The area was notorious for its treacherous ravines and dense, thorny underbrush. Harlan had strictly forbidden them from playing there as children. "Look at this." Wyatt pointed to a specific marking on the translucent paper. He drew a ridge here and this little water droplet symbol, the weeping stone. Sloane's eyes widened, a spark of life returning to her pale face. "Grandpa always used to say he was saving for a rainy day. Do you think he hid money out there?" "Vivian got everything above ground," Wyatt murmured, rereading Finch's words in his head. "All properties above ground." He looked at his sister, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. "Sloane, Grandpa was an engineer. He built foundations, bunkers, basements." Wyatt fired up the Ranger's engine, the worn belt squealing in the rain. "We are not leaving. We are going hunting." The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the Oregon woods blanketed in a thick, suffocating fog. The air smelled of wet pine needles, rotting wood, and damp earth. Wyatt and Sloane had spent a miserable, sleepless night, huddled under a single moving blanket in the truck bed, waiting for the first sliver of morning light to safely navigate the woods. They left the truck hidden off an old logging road about 2 miles north of the main estate. Wyatt carried a flashlight, a heavy iron crowbar from his toolbox, and the brass watch. Sloane carried their only provisions, 2 bottles of water and a half-eaten sleeve of crackers. The hike was brutal. The northern acreage of Harlan's property was completely unmaintained. Mother Nature had aggressively reclaimed the land, choking the paths with thorny blackberry bushes and massive fallen Douglas firs. They spent the first hours just trying to find the initial landmark on the tiny drafting map, a split oak tree shaped like a tuning fork. "My feet are freezing," Sloane complained softly, slipping on a patch of slick moss and scraping her knee against a jagged rock. "I know. We are close, I promise," Wyatt lied, offering her his hand and pulling her up. He checked the brass compass in the watch. "The map says we need to head due east from the tuning fork tree, down into the ravine." As they descended into the gully, the temperature seemed to drop. The canopy above was so thick that the morning light was choked out, casting the forest floor in a gloomy twilight grey. The silence here was oppressive, broken only by the snapping of twigs under their wet sneakers and the distant rushing sound of water. "Water," Wyatt whispered, stopping in his tracks. He listened intently. "Do you hear that?" Sloane nodded. They pushed through a dense thicket of ferns and emerged into a small, hidden clearing tucked against the side of a massive, sheer rock face. Water was cascading down the dark, algae-covered stone, pooling into a muddy basin below. "The weeping stone," Sloane breathed, looking up at the trickling water. Wyatt referenced the map, then looked at the brass watch. He moved closer to the rock wall. The map indicated that whatever they were looking for was right here, but all he saw was solid stone, roots, and years of accumulated deadfall. "There is nothing here, Wyatt," Sloane said, her voice finally breaking. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by the crushing reality of their homelessness. "It is just a rock. He was crazy in the end, remember? He was forgetting things. We are out here chasing ghosts while Vivian is drinking coffee in our kitchen." "No," Wyatt said stubbornly. He grabbed the crowbar. He was eccentric, not crazy. He knew exactly what he was doing. Wyatt began violently clearing the debris at the base of the rock wall. He swung the crowbar, hacking away at the thick vines, dragging heavy rotted logs out of the way, his hands blistering and bleeding. Minutes passed. Sloane sat on a rock, burying her face in her hands, softly crying. Wyatt swung the crowbar at a thick patch of creeping ivy clinging to the stone. Clang. The sound echoed sharply through the quiet ravine. It was not the dull thud of iron hitting rock. It was the distinct resonant ring of metal striking metal. Sloane's head snapped up. Wyatt froze. He dropped to his knees and began tearing at the ivy with his bare hands, ripping the tough vines away in massive clumps. Mud and dead leaves showered down on him, but he did not care. As the green veil fell away, a shape began to reveal itself in the side of the mountain. It was a door. Not a wooden shed door, but a massive industrial steel bulkhead, painted a faded olive drab and heavily camouflaged to match the texture of the surrounding rock. It looked like it belonged on a battleship, complete with a heavy circular rotary wheel in the center. "Oh my God," Sloane whispered, rushing over to stand beside him. She reached out, her trembling fingers brushing the cold, damp steel. Wyatt grabbed the rotary wheel and pulled with all his might. It was shut, welded in place by decades of damp weather. "It is locked." Wyatt panted, wiping sweat and mud from his forehead. He looked around the frame, searching for a keyhole, a padlock, anything. There was nothing, just smooth, impenetrable steel. He pulled the brass pocket watch from his pocket, staring at it. "Stop crying. Start winding." "Sloane, look at the center of the wheel," Wyatt said, his heart racing. In the very center of the rusted steel wheel was a small circular indentation. It was not a keyhole. It was perfectly round, with tiny grooves cut into the sides. Wyatt held up the brass pocket watch. The circumference of the watch perfectly matched the indentation on the door. With bated breath, Wyatt pressed the back of the pocket watch into the center of the wheel. It slid in perfectly, the grooves catching the edges of the timepiece. "Stop crying. Start winding." Wyatt gripped the protruding winding crown of the pocket watch. He took a deep breath, braced his feet against the mud, and turned the crown clockwise. A loud mechanical clack echoed from deep within the mountain, then another. Wyatt kept turning. With every twist of the crown, heavy internal deadbolts could be heard sliding back within the steel door. It was a mechanical marvel, a master class in hidden engineering. Harlan had not just built a bunker, he had built a vault. After full rotations, the crown stopped. A hiss of pressurized stale air expelled from the seams of the door, blowing decades of dust and dead pine needles into their faces. "Help me!" Wyatt grunted, grabbing the heavy steel wheel. Sloane grabbed on, and together, the two teenagers threw their entire body weight backward. With a horrific grinding screech of rusted hinges, the massive steel door slowly swung open, revealing a pitch-black void inside. The air that poured out was dry, smelling of old paper, motor oil, and preserved leather. Wyatt clicked on his flashlight, its beam piercing the profound darkness. What the light revealed made both of them stop breathing. This was no dirt cave. This was no simple root cellar. They were standing at the entrance of a massive, concrete-lined cavern, stretching back further than the flashlight beam could reach. Suspended from the high ceiling were rows of industrial fluorescent lights, but it was what sat on the floor of the cavern that made Wyatt drop his crowbar in shock. Lined up in perfect, immaculate rows, resting on polished concrete, were vehicles. Not just any vehicles. Vintage, pristine automobiles, gleaming under decades of dust covers. A Ferrari, a Mercedes-Benz, a Shelby Cobra. Millions, perhaps tens of millions of dollars worth of automotive history parked silently in the belly of the mountain. And at the very center of the room, sitting on a wooden drafting table, was a single leather-bound ledger, illuminated by a battery-powered lantern that Harlan must have left. Wyatt and Sloane stepped over the threshold, crossing from the world of the discarded into a kingdom their grandfather had secretly built just for them. The heavy steel door creaked behind them, but neither looked back. They were about to discover that the cars were only the beginning of Harlan's secrets, and the real treasure, the one that would destroy Vivian and David entirely, was waiting inside that leather ledger. Wyatt and Sloane stood frozen just inside the massive steel bulkhead, the heavy Oregon air behind them feeling a world away. Inside the subterranean vault, the atmosphere was perfectly climate-controlled. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint rhythmic hum of a massive industrial dehumidifier hidden somewhere in the shadows. Wyatt stepped forward, his mud-caked sneakers squeaking against the pristine, polished epoxy floor. He aimed his flashlight down the row of vehicles, his mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of what they were looking at. To their left sat a Ferrari, its red paint gleaming flawlessly under the beam of light. Next to it was a Mercedes-Benz, an automotive unicorn that Wyatt had only ever read about in his grandfather's vintage magazines. Further down the line sat a pristine Shelby Cobra, an immaculate Aston Martin, and a row of classic Porsches that looked as though they had just rolled off the assembly line. "Wyatt," Sloane whispered, her voice trembling as she walked toward the Shelby, terrified to even touch the gleaming chrome. "These are not just cars. These are museum pieces. This is tens of millions of dollars." "More," Wyatt corrected, his voice hollow with shock. He remembered Grandpa Harlan showing him a picture of a Ferrari in an old Sotheby's auction catalogue. That car alone sold for over $40 million, he thought, his head spinning. He tore his eyes away from the fortune in steel and chrome and walked toward the center of the cavern. Under a pool of warm battery-powered lantern light sat a heavy oak drafting table. On it rested the thick, leather-bound ledger he had spotted from the doorway. Beside the ledger was the modern, heavy-duty Pelican case, a set of brass keys on a ring, and a sealed envelope with Wyatt and Sloane written in Harlan's unmistakable handwriting. Wyatt picked up the envelope. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely slide his finger under the flap. He pulled out a single sheet of heavy cream paper. Sloane hurried over to his side, leaning against his shoulder as they read their grandfather's final words together. "My dearest Wyatt and Sloane, if you are reading this, it means my heart finally gave out, and you had the grit, the intelligence, and the desperation to solve the puzzle I left behind. I am sorry I had to put you through this ordeal. I am sorry I had to let David and Vivian throw you out into the cold. But you see, I knew Vivian's true nature the moment your father brought her home. I knew that the second I was in the ground, she would sink her venomous fangs into my estate and cast you aside. I could have left everything to you in my primary will, but Vivian is cunning. She would have tied you up in probate court for years, bleeding the estate dry with predatory lawyers like Gregory Finch until you had nothing left to fight with. So, I built a trap. I gave her exactly what she wanted, the house, the land above ground, and the petty cash. Let her choke on it. Years ago, I legally severed the mineral and subterranean rights of the northern acres from the main estate. I formed a blind trust and a Delaware-based entity named Weeping Stone Holdings, LLC. Everything in this vault, the vehicles, the gold bullion in the safe beneath this desk, and the controlling shares of my commercial real estate portfolio belongs entirely to that LLC, and as of my death, you two are the sole uncontested owners of Weeping Stone Holdings. Inside the black case on this desk is a satellite phone. Programmed into the speed dial is Jonathan Pierce, a senior managing partner at the law firm in Seattle. He is my true attorney. He has been waiting for your call. Call him. Let him unleash hell. I love you both. Build a beautiful life. Make them pay. Grandpa Harlan." Tears streamed down Sloane's face, splashing onto the polished wood of the drafting table. "He did not abandon us," she sobbed, burying her face in Wyatt's chest. "He was protecting us the whole time." Wyatt wrapped his arms tightly around his little sister, the crushing weight of the last hours finally lifting off his shoulders. The despair that had choked him in the cab of his rusted truck was gone, replaced by a surging, white-hot fire. Harlan had given them a sword. Now it was time to swing it. Wyatt unlatched the heavy clasps of the Pelican case. Inside sat a matte black iridium satellite phone. He powered it on, waiting for the signal bars to connect to the network orbiting thousands of miles above the Oregon canopy. He dialed the single programmed number. It rang only twice. "Pierce speaking." A deep, authoritative voice echoed through the receiver. "Mr. Pierce," Wyatt said, his voice steady, mature, and ringing with newfound authority. "My name is Wyatt Bennett. I am standing in a vault under Blackwood Creek with my sister Sloane." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Wyatt could hear the sound of a leather chair creaking, followed by a heavy sigh of relief. "Wyatt," Pierce said, his tone shifting into sharp professional focus. "I have been waiting for this call. Your grandfather was a brilliant man. Are you two safe?" "We are safe," Wyatt replied. "But Vivian kicked us out. She took the house. She thinks she won." "She thinks she owns an empty shell," Pierce corrected smoothly. "The documents in that ledger give you complete financial supremacy. I have a specialized appraisal team and a team of private security contractors on standby. We are flying out in minutes. Stay in the vault. Do not engage your stepmother until I am standing beside you. We are going to take everything back." Wyatt looked at his sister, who was wiping her eyes and smiling for the first time since their grandfather died. "We will be waiting, Mr. Pierce," Wyatt said. He hung up the phone, looking out over the millions of dollars of pristine vintage steel. They were not homeless orphans anymore. They were the masters of the Bennett Empire. Weeks later, the sun shone brightly over the manicured lawns of the Bennett estate. Vivian had wasted absolutely no time. Believing she had triumphed completely, she had already contacted an international realty firm to list the acres for a staggering amount. Today was the private, invite-only open house for elite developers and foreign investors. The driveway was lined with sleek sedans, Range Rovers, and Porsches. Caterers in crisp white uniforms circulated the sprawling stone patio, serving champagne and beluga caviar to the wealthy guests. Vivian stood by the grand marble staircase in the foyer, wearing a tailored suit and a diamond necklace she had charged to the estate's depleted accounts just days prior. Beside her stood David, looking perpetually uncomfortable in a stiff suit, swirling a glass of scotch and avoiding the gaze of anyone who walked past. Gregory Finch, the corrupt estate lawyer, hovered near the caviar station, looking thoroughly pleased with himself. "It is a beautiful property, Mrs. Bennett," a wealthy developer remarked, admiring the vaulted ceilings. "Though I am curious about the title. Are there any encumbrances, specifically regarding the Northern Forestry?" Vivian laughed, a high, piercing sound. "Oh, none at all. The entire acres is completely unencumbered, a clean slate for whatever you wish to build." Outside, the crunch of gravel interrupted the soft classical music playing from the patio speakers. The guests turned to look as a massive, heavy-duty flatbed transport truck, flanked by two black Cadillac Escalades, rolled slowly up the winding driveway. Vivian's smile faltered. "What on earth is that? Delivery drivers are supposed to use the service entrance." But the vehicles did not stop. They bypassed the valet line and parked directly in front of the main portico. The doors of the lead Escalade opened. Stepping out into the sunlight was Wyatt Bennett. He was no longer wearing the muddy, torn clothes he had been thrown out in. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored navy suit. Beside him stepped Sloane, looking elegant and composed in a dark designer dress. Behind them emerged Jonathan Pierce, flanked by two towering men in dark suits, who looked distinctly like private security. But it was what sat on the flatbed truck that made the guests gasp. Resting on the transport, gleaming like a ruby in the afternoon sun, was the Ferrari. Vivian's face drained of all color. She marched toward the front doors, her heels clicking furiously against the marble. "Wyatt, what is the meaning of this? How dare you show your face here? And whose car is that? Get this circus off my property immediately, or I am calling the police." Wyatt did not flinch. He casually adjusted his cuffs and walked up the front steps, stopping just inches from his stepmother. He looked down at her, his eyes as cold as the stone beneath his feet. "It is not your property, Vivian," Wyatt said, his voice carrying perfectly across the silent, staring crowd of investors. "Excuse me," Vivian shrieked, looking at David for support. David merely stared at the Ferrari, his jaw slackened in utter disbelief. Jonathan Pierce stepped forward, opening a leather briefcase. "Mrs. Bennett, my name is Jonathan Pierce. I represent Weeping Stone Holdings, LLC, the sole legal owner of the subterranean rights, the overarching trusts, and the majority holding company that legally owns this house." Finch, the slimy estate lawyer, pushed his way to the front. "That is impossible. The will clearly stated—" "The will you read was a decoy, Mr. Finch. Pierce interrupted smoothly, handing the flustered lawyer a thick stack of court-stamped documents. Silas Bennett engineered a secondary trust years ago. Your client, Mrs. Bennett, inherited the physical structure of this house, yes? However, she does not own the land it sits on, nor does she own the access roads. Furthermore, the liquid assets she inherited were heavily leveraged against loans held by Weeping Stone Holdings, loans that my clients, Wyatt and Sloane Bennett, are calling in, effective immediately. Finch scanned the papers, his hands beginning to shake. He looked up at Vivian, his face pale. Vivian, it is bulletproof. They own the land. They own the debt. They own everything. Vivian stumbled back as if she had been physically struck. No, he left it to me. I took care of him. You two are nothing but ungrateful brats. Sloane stepped forward, looking Vivian dead in the eye. You took care of his bank accounts, Vivian, and then you threw us out into the rain with $5. Wyatt handed a folded piece of paper from his suit pocket. It was a formal eviction notice, signed by a federal judge. He handed it to Vivian, who refused to take it, letting it flutter to the marble floor. You have minutes to pack a single bag, Wyatt said, his voice eerily calm, echoing the exact words she had used on him. My security team will escort you. Anything left behind will be seized to pay off the debts you owe our holding company. David! Vivian screamed, turning to her husband. Do something! David looked at his son, then at his daughter, then finally at the woman who had poisoned his family. For the first time in his life, he showed a glimmer of awareness. He set his Scotch glass down on a side table and slowly shook his head. I have nothing to say, Vivian. They won. The crowd of wealthy investors murmured among themselves, rapidly realizing the auction was a sham and that the real power in the valley had just returned home. As the private security team stepped forward to escort a hysterically sobbing Vivian up the stairs, Wyatt turned his back on her. He looked at the Ferrari, then over at Sloane, who was smiling radiantly. They had walked into the woods as discarded children, but they had walked out as the masters of their own destiny. Grandpa Harlan's weeping stone had stopped shedding tears, and the valley finally belonged to the Bennetts once again. Wyatt and Sloane's journey proves that the greatest inheritance is not just wealth, but the resilience and cleverness passed down to us. Karma always collects its debts, and sometimes the people we underestimate hold the keys to the kingdom. If this story of justice and hidden treasure kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more incredible real-life storytelling.